Okay, go ahead and get started. What I'm going to be talking about is customer experience data, how to collect it, how to manage it in a maintainable way. And my name is Tim Fluehr. I'm a lead UI engineer at Comcast. And of course, it stops working immediately. See if it stays connected this time, otherwise I'll just wing it. There we go. Experience data is basically all the information you collect about your website, your user sessions, analytics, information for chat providers, targeting solutions, error tracking, logging, user interactions, all that information. Usually when this type of information is collected on your site, it's all done in an individual fashion. Supply these values to analytics, supply these other values to your logging system. Do this type of information for error tracking. From a maintenance standpoint, all those separate providers can cause just a few issues where your code's going in every direction and a lot of repeated code. And if you ever change your analytics provider, you basically have to start over because you have to now rewrite all of your code for the different analytics provider. Across the industry, this basically was recognized as a problem. W3C working group came up with a taxonomy and structure, but it's actually not a specification, but a lot of people treat it as one, just from the sheer number of companies that were involved in it: Google, IBM, Best Buy, et cetera, and so on. With that structure, they basically came up with a unified taxonomy, human readable form of where to put all this information, along with privacy practices and a specification for how to use it. I will show that up. Customer experience, digital data, working group, all the people that were involved. And it's pretty in-depth, covers a lot of things of information that you'd want to collect, whether it's about the page, shopping cart, products. In addition, all the privacy guidelines that I talked about, but it also defines the structure for how you add your custom values into that structure. It defines the data layer as a global variable called digital data, which is just pure JSON, which is great from if you're supplying everything at once, but when you have to add a property, it becomes tricky. And what if another developer in your code base didn't realize you were setting it up and assigned it a new value? They just wiped out all the stuff that you put in. So in terms of implementation, we've now got our taxonomy, our structure, our guidelines, but implementation's still a little bit lacking. So what I did is I built an implementation for Comcast to kind of solve this, where we now add our properties into non-JavaScript script blocks. For those that haven't used those, they get completely ignored by the browser, so we just use them as buckets for our standard information. But then in terms of event tracking, we add a data attribute onto whatever elements we want to track. And we still have a fallback method using jQuery custom events to supply any custom information that doesn't fit the standard guidelines. About a demo, this actual page is the demo. While we've been going through, everything I've done in this session so far has been tracked as part of the data layer, and it's being output to the console, where we have our digital data object, version page, page information, attributes, and every time I hit the keyboard, navigate it slides, forward, backwards, all of that showed up as a user event in the data layer for information. If I clear it, if I click the button, you'll see the last item in this events array. Like according to the taxonomy, you have an array of events, which is all your user interactions in between page views, where automatically said, okay, came from a button, click, the selector with the, again, click, and then the text from inside the button. If we go into the inspector, you'll see on the button, I've just put data-tracking. The implementation pulled everything else where the button itself, data-tracking said, I want to watch this for user interaction. It combined that with data-tracking from its parent, whereas container button. Went up to the field set, there's data-tracking. It's invalid JSON, so it didn't get included. That's invalid JSON because for JSON to be valid, your keys must be in double quotes, so that if we looked at the console when it parses that, we get a warning out saying what's going on to help us track down information. In production, of course, none of these logs would come out. It's a global flag on the document to output our logging information. What's nice about this implementation is right now this button is sitting inside of our container button. I'll move it into the checkbox. Didn't change any of my JavaScript, anything else. You'll notice it automatically picked up its new container. So as your markup moves around, you don't actually have to touch any of your data collection. If you set up your properties on the proper elements, as the markup changes, all your analytics and all your data collection stays the same. So once you implement it, you don't have to implement it again. And built into the implementation is checkboxes, radio buttons, buttons, anchors, and so forth, basically any user actionable item, including videos and audio. So if I play this video, would help if I played the right video. Of course, I forgot to hook the sound up, but you see I had a play action, I had a pause action, pulled up all the information, and all of this still works. Video, you drop any new video into the page, you create it through JavaScript. As long as you had data tracking on it, it's monitored. So if I go in the inspector and look at this video, the only thing on the video itself is the title of the video. Everything else is pulled from the ancestors or automatically generated by the implementation. Once we have the data, because all of this that we've seen so far in the console is just gathering information. We're not actually sending it anywhere. That's where there's a secondary layer to this to separate out your concerns from data collection to data notification, where if you're using Google Analytics, you would load a plugin for Google Analytics. Some third parties, because they were involved with the W3C, already support data layer implementation. So at that point, it's, do they support it? If they do, and they can operate off of jQuery custom events, you actually don't have to change a thing short of include the third-party code in your site. If they can and they can't operate off of jQuery, then we can create miniature plugins to just notify them whenever we've done an update. If they can't, then we can create a plugin that modifies the data into a form they can understand and provides it to them. The reason for the plugins is it gives us that separation where everything we've seen is all about collection of the information. We have it in the data layer, and now as a secondary, we provide it to these different systems, whether it's sending it to our own internal logging system or sending it to Google Analytics. I will pull up the plugins. To start with, I will show you a miniature Ajax plugin that I loaded. You'll see right here, Ajax sent. Every time I do an operation, that was showed a fragment of the slide, we get another Ajax sent notification, and it's sending an Ajax request to a dummy page right now with the contents of the data layer. Here's the plugin for that. You'll see 90% of this is actual, like, just versioning and debug code. That tracking trigger is the custom event that the implementation fires off every time data layer is updated. And all we're doing here is whenever that data layer is updated, we send an Ajax response with digital data. So our plugin is actually a couple lines of code. The rest is just to make sure it's error trapped, make sure it's safe, and help us with debugging if anything goes wrong. Another plugin that we have, and in terms, I'll show you in terms of loading a plugin in the page. Tracking.js is the implementation. Tracking Ajax is the plugin for Ajax, and then here is a Google Analytics plugin that I wrote yesterday. So now, not only am I building out the data layer, sending it to Google Analytics, and sending it to Ajax every time an operation happens. So you'll see each time we get the Ajax sent and the Google Analytics. Say you switch from Google to Adobe or another analytics provider, you remove your Google Analytics plugin and add a plugin for the other provider, where you don't actually have to change any of your data collection at all. It makes your code a lot easier to maintain and adjust as things change from the business side of things. Okay. Lost the connection between slides, of course. And of course, nothing is working right now. There we go. I'll just go off the main thing. When we view source of our page, we have separate script blocks. The implementation goes and finds all of these and combines them together. So say you do an Ajax request for partial content, but that needs to add something to the data layer. You include a script block where if it's -page or -site info or -anything except for digital data, that top level part of digital data is created. So like in here, if I zoom in, so we have page is tracking data page, but you can also supply, if you've got all of your information in the simplest form all together in one to be provided at once, you can provide the entire data layer at once and it'll be combined together. Now the reason for this is you saw how the events keep getting added on, but in the case of a single page app, you may have multiple page views per page. Like when you're in a single browser page, you may have multiple page views. So what you need to do is notify the system that I need to re-update the data layer to clear out events and reset everything to its expected state by any changes that happened. And this entire implementation runs off of jQuery custom events. So I just reset the data layer. You'll see events is an empty array, and we're starting over again, and it reset it to all of the script blocks that were in the page, where the plugins are, they update their version, their descriptions from the plugins themselves, and then when I view this, You'll see I only have a single block in this demo, just for example purposes, to show what resetting the data layer does. And that, by having these combination of blocks, it's whenever I do that trigger, it searches the entire DOM for any of these script blocks, combines them together, including, you'll notice in this sample here, page name and refer, page name and URL. If both of these were included in the page name would be the second one. The last one always wins. It combines them all together, layers them on top of one another, so that you don't have to worry about the structure. You just provide the properties that you want in the page, and then if there's any conflicts, it finds the last one and uses that for you. So all three of these would be combined, so we would have a data layer with page, other info, page name of Liberty.js Demo Home 2, the URL, and the refer, because it combined all of those properties together. Let's see. I'll show you another one. Pulling up one more file so we can do an adjustment. One thing you'll notice here when I change slides, we have our events. Each slide, I'm making each slide view an event where it fills in the slide changed information. I'll show you the code that I use to do that, and also show you a quick change to it. Using reveal for this presentation on slide changed, I trigger that custom event that I mentioned previously, setting the type and the previous slide. Say we want to change this to track slides not as events, but as a single page app by page. I changed the word DOM to page, and now when I and of course, there we go. You'll see it reset everything, plugins, event type of slide changed, because I wiped out all the page information by passing in the other information. Before, how we had our events kept filling up every time I changed slides. Now we are resetting the data layer every single time. So any new events would take precedence. When we're talking about user events, you don't want to have to write JavaScript for every one, so those buttons, links, anchors I showed went all by the data-tracking. You'll see here I have outer div, field set, inner div, and button. If I go and click this, you'll see we have our event info, field set, event name, event action. Oh. Yeah. Event action is click me because that's automatically taken from the button. Inner div is not valid JSON, so we got a notification from the data layer implementation that isn't being picked up. Field set has I am here. We don't have data tracking outer div, because part of the implementation is based on your business rules. You may want to stop that propagation to keep all of your values within a certain section. So there's an additional property that you can add on for data tracking parent to set your scope. walk through some of the code for some of the script blocks. This is the Google Analytics plugin I wrote yesterday. You can see again, we have that same entry point of tracking trigger. And it goes through, and all of this code is related to turning our data layer values into values that Google Analytics expects. So we pull our values off of data layer, put them into our payload, and we send that to Google Analytics in simplest terms. The rest of this I kind of just figured out yesterday because I hadn't used Google Analytics before. The actual implementation, you'll see I use an object structure for the code. Everything's done through object variables. Debugging calls throughout. For this, I've actually removed a lot. There's still some comments in here, but I removed a lot of the comments just so I can see if I can remember what I was thinking when I did this. We set up all of our selectors, always using the previous properties to help keep it maintainable, using CSS selectors throughout. And then we do bind our listeners. You notice we don't do anything except for setting up our variables and binding our event listeners at the beginning. Our event listeners, the two that you've seen so far, are -dom and -page. Page does the page view, DOM does event tracking, pulling all those informations off of the elements. There's also one that's just tracking log. That is, if you have a situation where you want to be in control of everything that gets put on the data layer, event or total in any combination, tracking log says you know what you're doing and you're setting everything yourself manually. And then we have our click observer to handle clicking on all of our elements that we've set up. And then audio and video tags are handled separately because jQuery does not support bubbling for audio and video tags. So we have to go through the capturing, like jQuery doesn't support the capturing phase. So we have to go through and do old school add event listener. You'll see just, for example, tracking the media state. All these helper functions are for if it's a media tag, get these properties, current time, duration, tag name, because that's all specific to media. Then it goes back into the tracking log DOM call that we were using for everything else, which goes to, in terms of pattern, to keep this, because it's doing a lot, as maintainable as possible. We go through collecting all the elements that we care about, whether it's the script blocks, whether it's the ancestral DOM elements, and we put them into an array. When we have our array of elements we care about completely built, we pass those elements into a single function that navigates through pulling all the JSON off of the elements if it's valid, merging it all together, and then returning it back. So to collect JSON from elements, throughout this code you see Lodash and jQuery. They're not absolutely required. We could refactor this to not use them, but on every site we were already using, we had Lodash and we had jQuery. So instead of rewriting all of the logic we were using from them, we just included them as part of the implementation. We just last week ran into a site that didn't have Lodash. Still had jQuery, but did not have Lodash. So I put in here a build system to build just the minimal amount of Lodash that we need, because Lodash has a build system, if people didn't know, to say, I'm using these 4 functions, and it'll give you a build of Lodash that only includes those 4 functions. But again, lots of debugging code throughout, building up our JSON, and pulling the properties off of the elements and merging it together into a large array. This is probably the most complicated form in here. If anybody has any questions about how I went in and combined anything, let me know. And then the last part through the DOM was setting our default values for events, where we check our selectors, make sure we don't already have a property, because our defaults are lowest priority. If these values were provided from anywhere else, we don't want to override them. We want to take what the individual elements or the custom event triggers passed in. As you can see, that was for events. As you can see, page track is a lot simpler than DOM, because it just has to worry about those groups of script blocks. And custom is the simplest by far, because it's saying, you know what you're doing, I'm going to take whatever you give me and use just that. Let all of these functions pass through set data layer to actually output all of these combined properties onto the data layer global variable digital data. Pushes the event in if it was already created, and then the last thing it does, because that was triggered from our trigger, it sends off that custom event that I mentioned previously for the Ajax and for the Google Analytics, for the plugins to tie in and listen for those, or other third parties that already support data layer. They can tie right into that and just say, okay, data layer's been updated, let me do whatever I need to do, whether it's sending the information to the server, for logging purposes, for error notification, for analytics, for chat providers, whatever it is. And that takes us through the basics of it. If anyone has any questions, please let me know. I can walk through anything, any more depth you want to go into on anything. But the main goal of this was to allow, by just changing our DOM properties around, allow all of our data collection to stay the same. Because previously in different code bases, you would have analytics and it was hard-coded. Everything was passed in just the format that the analytics wanted. Then an A/B targeting provider was added. A lot of the same properties were regenerated and put into the targeting provider. So we were hitting performance bottlenecks, code maintenance nightmares, because they would change it for the targeting, but not change it for the analytics. Where now, by going into a central repository, everything's generated once, and then all of the other places just use it. Just read out of it. Some people in the past have asked me if this type of implementation is for like getting around ad blocking systems or privacy protections. No, it's purely about maintainability and making the code maintainable from the collection standpoint. All the ad blockers, everything else is still tied into Google Analytics or whatever other system you're using to transmit the information. Yes?
Do you ever use a customer experience management tool like T-Link for user replay or ClickTail?
Yeah, and user replay is on some sites inside of Comcast. I haven't gone into the details of it, but even those, it's reading information, and all of them can read. Like they will read the content of the page, read all of that information. But there's also times where you want to provide specific session information, like your session ID for repeatability through server logs, things like that. That's where you would put that into the data layer, and they can read out of that.
That's what if you're doing kind of integration with them, like kick it up into, some people use those tools like your customer support, something like that, some additional analytics through data layer.
Yeah, data layer, this implementation in Comcast is still in its infancy. It's started already in production on, I think, 3 different products. We've got another 4 that are under development. And then we're going to start tying in more tools. We're starting with analytics and targeting and moving on from there. But so far, it's that from the validation standpoint, QA loves it because they used to have to, for the analytics providers, well, check to see if, use the Google Analytics plugin, or check to make sure that the requests are being sent through a network monitoring tool. Now they just check the console. If it's in the console, they're done. Then it's on the other side, is the provider working correctly? But for the development teams, for QA validation, is the value in the console? Is it correct in the console? They're done. Anyone else? Yes?
When are some of the third parties that support this? Do you know?
That's where I know Adobe reads out of it. According to the list of companies, I haven't worked with most of these, but they were involved in the creation of it, so I'm sure in some way or another, at some level, they all support data layer because they were involved in creation of the W3C spec.
Thank you.
And where with the plugins, even if a provider doesn't support it or doesn't support it yet, depending upon your leverage, you can say, oh, well, we have this object, we have this event. Go ahead and read the information out. If they don't, you can write a small plugin where the Google Analytics one of the more complex ones I wrote yesterday. Yeah?
What do people do if they're using data layer and they find like a new categorization for the taxonomy?
That's where for the taxonomy, you want to make sure across your code bases you're using a unified taxonomy. The W3C document gives a good starting point, but it doesn't have everything. So we've been working through internal to Comcast to create our own taxonomy for those extra properties. And whenever somebody has something that doesn't fit in the existing taxonomy, we sit down, have a discussion across the different groups of where do we want to put this type of information. The W3C document gives a pattern for putting these custom properties. It says, okay, if you're going to use this property, specific things are required. If you have something that's not listed here, follow this pattern where it's usually a property called attributes, and you add your additional information inside of that, like if it's related to page, but you can even add your own top-level items. Because you'll see here, I added version and plugins. Neither one of those are in the W3C spec, in the W3C document. But they made sense in terms of the implementation to show that information. So when we have version differences, as things are improved, the different code bases know what they're using and the providers know what they're using, and we can switch off of that with change logs. But those two properties aren't specifically in the W3C document, but they were added because it's a JSON structure. As long as you manage it and keep it consistent to your own group. Like our starting point is if our values fit into the W3C document, those are the properties we use. That way we're as consistent as we possibly can be with that document. Yes?
So you were talking about how you might have a testing provider, an analytics provider, an air tracking provider, who might be sending this same or similar information to all of these. Now that you've done this work to centralize it into kind of like one format, would there be could you consider instead of making requests to all three different services, funneling it through server side, so there would be one request?
We've actually, on some systems, we've actually already started looking at that now that we're centralizing it, to send all the information up to our server and then send the requests out from a server-side plugin. It's going to depend on the individual thing. For A/B targeting, a lot of times they want to do that without doing the extra request to your server, so they want to go direct, but with something like chat, that might work. With something like analytics, that may work. Especially if you're doing multiple analytics providers, it's not they really need to change anything in the page, they just need the information. Yeah, but that's definitely something you can do, and you could have a plugin that sends it to your server, or there's even third parties that do that type of request combining, and you can have a plugin that sends the information to them. Any other questions? Okay, that's all I have. Thank you. I'll be down here if you have any other questions.